Hello everyone, I'm Saadia Yunus. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm here today to walk you through the tool Decatastrophizing. Anxiety is something that makes us think of all of these negative things and the worst possible outcomes. We get into this cognitive distortion or this way of thinking that is catastrophizing, right? We think of the worst case scenario, the most horrible thing that can happen, and it really can make us go into a downward spiral. What you'll need for this tool is a paper and something to write with. And something to know about catastrophizing is that we get into this mindset when we're worried about something. Okay, so when you're doing this tool with me, I want you to think about what you're worried about. So you've grabbed that paper and that pen, and let's get started. So the first thing that you're gonna think about is what you're worried about, what's on your mind, what are you stressed about? What's something that you think is going to happen? Like something bad that's going to happen. An example could be, one of my friends is upset with me. I'm worried about what she's thinking, what I've done. I go into this worst case scenario of our friendship is gonna end. But that's just an example, it's my example. You write down what you're worried about, what you're worried will happen. What are you predicting will happen? What is the worst thing that could possibly happen? I want you to be clear when you're writing this down. Don't write what ifs, okay? So what ifs doesn't make it clear. So if I'm like, what if she won't stop talking to me again? I want to write instead, my friend will stop talking to me. Write that down. The next part is asking yourself this question: how likely is this event to happen? Okay, and let's get a little specific here. So you're writing down, how likely is this event to happen? Has anything bad like this ever happened to you before? How often has something like this happened to you? Realistically, is this likely to happen now? In my example, how likely is it that my friend will completely cut me off because she's upset about something? Probably unlikely. We've gotten into things before. We've gotten upset with each other before. She's gotten upset with me before, and she hasn't cut me off. So write that down. Think about that catastrophe that you wrote about at the top of your paper and ask yourself, is it likely that this would happen? And now the next part is asking yourself, how awful would it be if this were to happen? How horrible would this be? And in my example, it would be pretty horrible. I would lose a friendship and I would feel so down and horrible about it. So I'd be writing down, yes, this would be pretty awful. So ask yourself that and write it down. How horrible would it be? And then to ask yourself, because we've already discussed the worst case scenario, so what would the best case scenario be? Also to write that down. How awful would the worst case scenario be? And then what would the best case scenario be? So in my example, it'd be pretty horrible, to not have my friend again. Best case scenario would be she'd forgive me and we'd move on, and our friendship may even be stronger. So what is your best case scenario of what you're worried about? Write that down. When you're thinking about the best case scenario, also think about write about what a friend would say to you about your worry. Oftentimes we are catastrophizing and we're thinking of the worst case scenario. But if we really sat down with a friend and talked to them about it, they would probably tell us that this worst case scenario is pretty unlikely to happen and would help us through it and walk us through it. So what would that friend say to you if you told them about this worst case scenario? And write that down. The next step is, suppose the worst did happen. How would you cope? How would you get through it? And write this down. And in my example, how would I cope? I would cry, I would journal, I would reach out to other friends. I've gone through a lot of tough things before, and I've gotten myself through it. So write that down. of how would you cope if the worst possible thing were to happen. Focusing on your resilience, focusing on the things that you've done to get through tough times in the past. What did you do to get yourself through it? Because you carried yourself to today. So what did you do to get yourself through it? What tools did you use? So that last step is, what positive and reassuring thing can you say to yourself about this worst case scenario? Catastrophe that you thought about in the very beginning. What can you say to yourself now about that catastrophe? After all of these steps that we've gone through, right? And everything that you've written down, looking at your paper, you wrote about the catastrophe. You wrote about how likely it is to happen. You wrote about how awful it would be and what a friend would say to you about this catastrophe. And then you also wrote about how you would cope with it if it were to occur. And now, what positive and reassuring thing can you say to yourself thinking about this catastrophe? Out of all of this work that we've done together and you wrote this down, what is the positive and reassuring thing that you can say to yourself about this situation? And when I think about mine, I can say to myself, you know what? Even if that worst case scenario were to happen and my friend completely stopped talking to me, I'd be able to cope. I'd get myself through it. I'd use the tools that I have, get myself through it, because I'm resilient. And so what would you say to yourself? What positive and reassuring thought can you write down for yourself right now on that paper when you think about this possible catastrophe? And I'll give you a moment. And now that you've written those words, and if you need a few more moments, please do continue to write. Just like we rated in the beginning how awful this catastrophe would be, I want you to also do that rating of how awful you believe that catastrophe would be now. From a 0% to 100%, 100 being the most awful, and 0% not being awful at all. And if I look back at my example, after everything that I said and the ways that I would cope and the reassuring words that I said to myself, maybe it'd be a 40%. So what about you? How awful would that catastrophe be now? Think about that for a moment and write it down for yourself. So I hope that this tool of decatastrophizing was helpful for you. This is a CBT tool on how to get yourself to stop catastrophizing and thinking of that worst case scenario that our mind will just automatically take us to when we're worried about something. I hope this tool was helpful for you and it helps you to continue to decatastrophize in those worst case scenario situations. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.